The snow-capped mountains, glaciers, and valleys of the eastern Himalayas sparkle in the sun. But it's not only ice that makes them glitter. On clear days, shattered pieces of aluminum glisten in the sunlight. This is the infamous aluminum alley, the Hump Route. Pilots who flew over the hump said they didn't need a compass. There were so many crashed planes along the route that they could navigate by the wrecks below.
Well, the reason they call the hump the camel hump. See, Dinjiang is the lower part of the camel. Then you get over to north of Missional, then you're going up one of the rivers, and then when you get over the river, then you got the hump. And then after you get the hump, then you got the neck of the camel.
From early 1942, the Hump Route, flying over the Himalayas, was the only channel for supplies to reach China. It was the lifeline that kept China supplied in the darkest days of the war.
There was no sea transportation into China. The Japanese controlled the coasts. There was no land transportation into China. The only way was through Japanese-occupied Burma.
1942 was the most difficult and critical year in World War II. From Europe to Asia and then to the Pacific, the fierce war and the feeling of imminent collapse had knocked the breath out of the Allies. The Japanese attack pushed the British out of Burma, cutting the last link into China, the Burma Road. With the road cut, China was completely isolated.
我们这一战的胜败，不仅关于我们国家民族的阵亡，更是关于全世界人类的后果。我们这一战经历了以雷霆大肆爆发的基础，如果失败了，就要接着白血复活的经历。
The situation was desperate. The Allies feared that without arms and ammunition, China would be forced to surrender. If that happened, the Japanese could transfer millions of soldiers from China to other battlefields. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked the Congress to grant aid to China. But granting aid was just the first step. They also had to figure out how to get it to China. The Japanese may cut the Burma Road, but I want to say to the gallant people of China that no matter what advances the Japanese may make, ways will be found to deliver airplanes and munitions of war to the armies of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. We remember that the Chinese people were the first to stand up and fight against the aggressors in this war. American senior political and military officials believed that supporting China would not only prevent the Japanese from deploying troops to Southeast Asia, but would also supply air bases in China from which American planes could bomb the Japanese homeland. While the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in bloody battles with the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Pacific Ocean, China was the main battlefield against the Japanese forces on land.
中国战场对美国在二战来讲，还是一个投资报酬率很高的战场。 因为只用的在比例来上零头的物质就能够牵制大量的日本军，不使他调到这个东南亚跟太平洋来作战。美国是基于一个全球战略的一个考量，可是中国不是啊。中国不单单是一个所谓的全球战略，中国是生死存亡的考量。
The massive Japanese army in Burma and China prevented the reopening of the Burma Road, so a highway in the sky was created instead. It went over the Himalaya mountains. Pilots called the air cargo route Flying the Hump. The Hump route connected India and China. At one end was India's Assam province, which was the Allied territory closest to the areas under China's control. Assam is located in the northeast corner of India. Before 1942, it was like a rag lying at the end of the world. The Dinjan airfield in Assam was the most important airfield at the Indian end of the Hump route. The Chinese terminus was in Kunming. The constant roaring of Hump aircraft taking off and landing in the Dinjan airfield went on from 1942 until the end of the war. I've flown from Natal to Ascension when the scum wasn't drained from the sumps. But it's nothing compared to the thrills you get in a ship flying over the hump, across the grim Himalayas. There's a million rock peaks, and you're sweating at 20,000 if the engine as much as squeaks. This is a poem written by an American hump pilot. In fact, flying over the hump was far more dangerous than he describes. It is 800 kilometers from Dinjan to Kunming as the crow flies. But then crows don't have to worry about Japanese fighter planes. After the Japanese captured the northern part of Burma, their fighters based there could intercept the defenseless transport planes. As a result, the transport route had to be shifted north to avoid Japanese fighters. But it was a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire. The new route had to pass over the Himalaya mountains, where pilots and planes encountered horrific weather conditions.
The atmosphere is very much like water in the ocean, and the currents and turbulence in the thing would be like being on the surface of the ocean, and the results are pretty much the same way.
There was an ongoing meteorological situation where warm, damp air would come up, turn into thunderstorms, and a thunderstorm is extremely hazardous. If a plane gets in it, no matter what size plane it is, can get torn up and thrown off. You don't want to be in a thunderstorm. Every pilot knows that.
We don't close the hump for weather. And I'll never forget one of the first times I got in one of these icing storms, the propellers would ice up. The leading edge of the propellers would ice up. And after a while, the de-icing equipment would cause these chunks of ice to come off of the propeller, and it would slam into the side of the fuselage, and you'd think the airplane is literally coming apart.
Flying the hump in bad weather was one of the toughest assignments in aviation. The men and the machines were flying at extreme limits of their endurance. By the war's end, the mountains claimed over 600 planes and over 1,000 crewmen.
就把飞机出毛病，出毛病的话准死无疑。因为掉了以后，你山连山，山套山，几百里后都是山，你怎么出去啊？你出去，你摔都摔死了嘛！你跳伞下去后，你也出不去嘛。
If you bailed out at those altitudes, you were going so fast when you hit the ground you would break both of your legs probably.
美军有过记录，人员跳伞正好在野人山一带。二战结束以后，美军进去过搜索，就发现人是跳伞成功，但是降落的时候是腿朝上倒挂在树上，身上只剩一副骷髅架了。
Some pilots called it the highway of death. The air crews flying it were from the U.S. Army Air Force Air Transport Command and the China National Aviation Corporation. War materials and personnel were the main cargo on the hazardous journey. Flying over the hump was the last stage of a long and perilous journey. Convoys of ships carried their vital cargoes from the west coast of America across the Pacific to Calcutta, India. Sometimes to evade the Japanese Navy, they had to go around the Indian Peninsula to reach Bombay or even Karachi on the west coast of the subcontinent. If so, the distance would exceed 12,000 miles. It was literally a journey halfway around the world. After that, the supplies had to traverse the intricate Indian railway network before finally arriving in Assam, 1,200 miles to the east. Each trip took 4 to 5 months to transport the supplies. Every drop of gasoline, every bullet and artillery shell, every grain, every piece of equipment had to go through the long journey just to arrive in Assam. Finally, it would be loaded onto transport aircraft for the toughest stage of all, the airlift over the hump. Each plane carried a load of between 3 and 8 tons. Over 700,000 tons of vital war materials were shifted this way. In 1942, the fate of China hung in the balance. Its survival depended on the performance of the planes and the courage of their pilots. Both elements would decide whether the United States transport aircraft were capable of flying over the Himalayas and going beyond its range limit and bringing the supplies to China.
一架飞机里年龄最大的基本上就26、7岁。机长超过31、2的没有，那都最大的。一个报务员，一个副驾驶都是23、24岁。你想想，实际上是3个孩子。
We were well aware of the threat of flying the hump was, but when you're 21 or 22 years old, you perceive yourself as being bulletproof. You don't worry about what's going to happen to you.
在一个漏雨的天，倾盆大雨或者说狂风骤起这么一个夜晚，飞一架飞机，在3吨多后，要从印度飞到中国昆明，就像蚂蚁搬家一样，一点一点、一滴一滴的，把这些东西从印度搬到中国来，支持中国人抗战。
Because each ant could only carry a small amount of cargo, the airlift ran 24 hours around the clock.
从这个7、8月份，全部改夜航，从昆明吃了饭，晚饭6、7点钟再飞印度，飞3个多小时嘛，到滨江大概是11多钟。因为那些装油啊，都不是机械，都是人抬的， 我还有一些相片，我找这个几个日子，因为人不够，还拿象大象来帮着抬起油箱，一装30个小时，在晋江，在装大概半夜3点钟了，从晋江要飞回昆明，所以天亮了，所以这样避开日本那个空袭，这样子相当艰苦。
From the records of American Hump pilot Stephen Cusack, we could see how intense the flights were. There was no let-up for the Chinese and American pilots flying the Hump. It was like a conveyor belt in the sky. Landing at Kunming Airport after all kinds of dangers, they had only 1 hour's rest. As soon as the plane was unloaded, they had to go right away back to Assam. It takes a lot of money to run a war. Frequently, the transport planes carried huge amounts of paper to India and then came back with the printed paper money. But sometimes the money rained from the sky.
One time, a friend of my father have the airplane catch ice, and then the engine start to broke. He make the other 2 people open the door, throw the money out. So I always think some poor village here, everybody, no money, everybody like this, and then out of the sky come all this money. That's true, they have to throw all the money out. So this happened many times. They throw gold out the window because the airplane is going to crash. The airplane is more valuable than the gold inside the airplane.
Along with fatigue and tension, these crew members had to suffer the shadow of death all the time. Each 1,000 tons of cargo flown to China cost 3 pilots' lives. The airmen had a slogan: a drop of gasoline, a drop of blood.
One time I was away on a mission in Chongqing around, and when I got to Kunming, they said we lost 20 planes last night. One night.
The Hump route was like a devil, devouring the crews one after another. Pilots were dragged and crashed on the route one by one. In 6 months, the China National Aviation Corporation suffered such heavy losses that it became seriously short of aircrew. The GM sent a telegram to the China Aviation Committee asking for help. Getting cargo over the Hump was so crucial that pilots were transferred from the Air Force to the China National Aviation Corporation to fly its transport planes. Long Chi-ming was one of them. He was a radio operator on a C-47 transport aircraft.
当时年轻也不懂事儿，反正是飞就飞嘛，创始就算了，这那个观念，没有想很多，啊，有些朋友早晨很几个都是早晨一起喝茶、喝咖啡嘛，10杯钱，一走那个走了，走了就走了。
Although the young pilots flew with passion and courage, initially only small amounts of supplies got through. Chennault and his China Air Task Force were experiencing the most difficult period. Every mission had to wait for days, impatiently accumulating supplies coming over the Hump route. In Chennault's words, "We had to fight, scream and scrape for every man, plane, spark plug, and gallon of gas." The China Air Task Force consisted of a fighter group and a bomber squadron. The commander of the fighter group was the legendary Colonel Robert Lee Scott Jr. He successfully led his force for the first 6 months before being transferred back to the States. In that time, Scott shot down 13 Japanese aircraft. After returning to the U.S., he published his memoirs. Entitled God is My Co-Pilot, they revealed his experience fighting in China. His book was later adapted into a movie by Warner Brothers and staged around the world. The fighter group's commander center was located in Guilin. It had less than 80 aircraft. Chennault used such a negligible power to fight the Japanese on an almost 5,000 miles front, from central and southern China to Burma and Vietnam. He constantly shifted his small force from one airfield to another on unoccupied Chinese territory, playing hide and seek with the Japanese.
他们的飞机啊，为了怕日本人知道他们到底有多少架飞机，所以他们经常在把飞机经常改号码，啊，尾巴尾翼号码改一改，什么东西改一改。然后他们基地很多，我今天在东部作战，明天我就跑到南部去作战，日本人反而变得更被动。
Owing to the scarcity of aviation fuel, munitions, and other materials, in August 1942, Chennault was forced to lower the mission frequency of the China Air Task Force. By the end of September, the China Air Task Force had only 38 pilots and 34 aircraft left. The fuel reserve could only last for 2 days. It was forced to lie low and become dormant. Chennault was anxious that while the China Air Task Force was not defeated in combat, it was jeopardized by the lack of materials. The two governments invested tremendous effort in order to improve traffic loads. The United States transferred more aircraft and pilots to the Hump operation. Controversially, pilots were ordered to fly regardless of the weather conditions. After that, no matter how bad the weather was, no matter how many Japanese fighters were on the way, between 100 and 500 transport planes flew over the hump around the clock.
It was very, very tiring. When you completed a round trip, when you landed back at Moenbury, you had felt like you'd done a real day's work. It was very fatiguing, especially when the weather was real bad. It was a real challenge physically to fly the airplane through these storms.
But since we had not been allowed to use weather as a reason for not flying, I think there was a general who decided that there was no weather that was too bad to fly in, so we flew.
We fly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather.
As the main terminus of the Hump route, Kunming Airfield earned the reputation as the world's busiest airport. With an average of 1 aircraft per minute taking off or landing, supply levels were restored. Once they were resupplied, Chennault's task force again went on the offensive. Ever since they captured Hong Kong, it was an important transport hub for the Japanese. Hong Kong was not only a maintenance and supply center of the Japanese Navy, but also an important transit base for the Air Force and departure port for naval escorts. In October 1942, the U.S. and Japanese forces were engaged in an intense battle around Guadalcanal Island in the South Pacific. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater. Both sides threw more and more forces for the battle. The Japanese gathered their forces in Hong Kong. It was a key staging post for the Guadalcanal battle. and it was a target Chennault couldn't resist. He'd bombed the Japanese fleet in the harbor and the port facilities. Chennault's planning officer for the raid was Marion Cooper. He's more famous for guiding another large operation. Cooper directed the first King Kong movie. The first step was to secretly transfer all available aircraft to airfields that could reach Hong Kong. The aircraft moved in small groups so as to not arouse Japanese suspicions. At dawn, October 25th, 12 B-25 bombers escorted by 7 P-40 fighters took off to bomb Hong Kong. This attack was a complete surprise. The Japanese forces only discovered there were American planes overhead when the bombs started falling on their heads. Within seconds, high explosive bombs fell onto the harbor, destroying docks, warehouses, oil tanks, and vessels. After the mission, while the U.S. planes were flying back to base, the escort fighters spotted Japanese interceptors seeking revenge for the attack. They dived down towards them. In the intense dogfights, the U.S. fighters got 11 Japanese planes. The B-25s also shot down 7 Japanese fighters, while losing just 1 plane of their own. The Hong Kong assault was the most successful operation since the establishment of the China Air Task Force. Chennault awarded medals to the participants in this mission. A month later, Chennault planned the raid on Canton. In addition to the successful bombing of the port, the U.S. Air Force also scored a brilliant 27-0 victory in dogfights. However, frequent missions used up Chennault's last bit of reserves. With equipment and supplies exhausted, the Air Force again went dormant. Everything depended on new supplies coming over the hump. The hump route is not only one of the most dangerous routes in the world, but also the longest, largest, and most costly wartime airlift operation during World War II.
The hump was a technical feat of great accomplishment. You know, it was like the Berlin airlift of 1947-48. You know, it accomplished a technical miracle of air transport.
For every ton of bombs Chennault threw at the Japanese, the transport group had to ship 18 tons of supplies to China. And this does not include the aircraft and crews devoured daily by this death route. On March 11th, 1943, 24-year-old American pilot Jim Fox, Chinese co-pilot Tan Xuan, and radio operator Wang Guoliang flew a fully loaded plane from Kunming to Assam. Behind it was the number 48 aircraft of the China National Aviation Corporation. Pete Gautier was the captain. The weather was great. Gautier was in a good mood. He used his handheld camera to film the number 53 aircraft. He never expected that this would become its final images.
Kunming! 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 Do you...
2 minutes later, Gautier witnessed the number 53 aircraft, previously flying like a beautiful bird, suddenly drop out of the sky like a boulder. Gautier circled around where the number 53 aircraft crashed, hoping to see survivors coming out of the wreckage. However, except for some of the debris in the dense forests, he could not see anything. The crash of aircraft number 53 was the only one which was witnessed by other pilots and whose precise position was known. However, it fell into Japanese-occupied territory, which made a ground search impossible. The position was reported to all the Hump pilots. Thereafter, whenever conditions allowed, they would try to fly near the crash site, hoping to see a miracle. However, they never saw anything. After the crash of the number 53 aircraft, the story was widely spread. Another Hump pilot, Fletcher Hanks, wouldn't believe that Fox died in that canyon. He was determined to find his comrades. A year later, the Japanese were forced to withdraw, and the crash site was reclaimed by China. Hanks organized a search team to go to the crash site. Among them was Stephen Cusack.
They're young people, 23, 24. They don't know. They never been in mountains. Two of them separate to go look for the airplane. And they use stick to choose. So my father go with Red Holmes to look for the airplane, and my father get very sick. He almost died.
The team searched in the forest for 9 days. They were forced to quit when food ran out and team members got ill.
My father always tells me the story many times. He says he never ever in his whole life felt so bad.
Later on, Hanks found out that the search team were just 1 mile from the crash site. After returning home, he was haunted by the idea of looking for Fox in the Gaolingong Mountains. He vowed he would return one day. He didn't know that it would be another 50 years to find the crash site. In 1996, local hunters found the plane wreckage on a ridge over 3,400 meters above sea level.
我们到那个点的时候，像它的那个飞机的翅膀啊，右翅膀上插着一根铁杉树，左翅膀是那个它摔下来的时候那个拍在地下的石头上，所以它左翅膀是它就有明显的断的这个痕迹，里边的那些都比较完整，还有包括它的那个累滩啊，累滩都还有气。
It was confirmed to be aircraft number 53. It was the best preserved aircraft among the hundreds of planes that crashed on the Hump. Unfortunately, even after several searches, no remains of the crew were ever found. The fate of Fox and his 2 Chinese crew members remains a mystery. After the discovery of the wreckage of aircraft number 53, The Chinese people faithfully guarded it for almost 2 years. In 1997, Hanks heard the news that the wreckage of the number 53 aircraft was found. He immediately flew to China. Coming to China again, Hanks was already 80 years old, but insisted on getting through the deep forests and coming to the crash site.
那到了这个上面这架飞机上，一到他就一看他就看出来这架飞机是他炸油的，他是非常熟悉的，哭了，他在那个地方跪起哭，摸起哭，话也讲不着了，他一直在哭啊，掉眼泪啊。
In 1998, the county government moved the wreckage down from the ridge to the nearest town. Chinese soldiers and civilians held a solemn ceremony to greet this plane which had lain in the mountains for over 50 years. They even built a memorial museum for it. Outside the museum, there are 3 stones memorializing the crew members. The restored aircraft was parked inside. Its huge fuselage murmurs about those days of tragedy and glory. In the 3.5 years of its operation, China and the U.S. invested over 2,700 aircraft and transported more than 800,000 tons of supplies and equipment on the Hump route. Over 80% of military supplies on the Chinese battlefield were provided by the Hump Airlift operation. It successfully enabled China to continue fighting the Japanese and to hold its position on the battlefield. Almost 1 plane per day. Over 1,500 planes in total crashed to keep this vital route open. More than 1,700 crew members were killed or missing. From late 1942 to early 1943, Chennault was in Kunming, frustrated. Sometimes war is more of a mathematical problem. Chennault knew he would need many more planes, pilots, and war materials to win this war. He believed that the era of aerial guerrilla war was coming to an end, and he already had plans to launch an ambitious strategic offensive against the Japanese.
他说他的构想是有3个，第一个是说他只要有1万吨的驼峰物资1个月，他就可以完成这3个构想。第一个，他要把日本在中国的空中武力全部消灭掉；第二个，他要把在中国沿海的日本海上补给线全部打掉；最后一个是对日本本土实施轰炸。他认为只要这3点办到了，日本就会投降。
Generalissimo and Madame Chiang enthusiastically embraced his plan. However, it was rejected by Chennault's superior, U.S. General Stilwell, the commander of the China-Burma-India Theater.
他掌握着这个驼峰空运的分配权。那史迪威是认为说是空军只是一个协助陆军的一个作战单位，啊，真正说你想要赢长这场战争呢，攻下这个基地呢，必须靠刺刀，必须靠步兵，靠刺刀把才能攻上下来。
一定程度上是因为陈纳德将军的观念太先进了，从空中打赢战争啊，这样的观念太先，反而是史迪威这样一位美国老派的军人所没有办法去想象，跟没有办法去接受的。
It took personal letters from Chiang Kai-shek and Chennault to U.S. President Roosevelt to break the impasse. The brilliant victories of Chennault's Flying Tigers had won him some currency in the U.S. His aerial strategy also deeply attracted President Roosevelt. Since the vision of a ground counter-offensive into Burma was not clear, Roosevelt decided to give priority to launch an air offensive in China. He believed it would simultaneously stimulate the morale of the Chinese people and effectively weaken the Japanese. Thus, the establishment of an independent Air Force under Chennault's command was on the agenda. However, Roosevelt's senior military advisors, including General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, vigorously disagreed.
Of course, as every strategist in their right mind recognized, this was ridiculous. It took 3 years of total war by the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, ultimately 2 atomic bombs, the Soviet entry into the war against Japan to get Japan to surrender, right? The notion that 500 planes was going to change the course of the war was, of course, ridiculous, but it was wonderfully appealing. This was low human cost in terms of American lives. Compare that to the, going into Iwo Jima or going into Okinawa. Thousands of people were killed. I mean, this seemed like almost a sanitary way. And again, this was the era of fascination with bombing, the idea that bombing could bring any enemy to its knees. And so I think Chennault appealed to that streak in the American imagination.
A Chinese lady's visit to the States provided the last push for Chennault's aerial strategy. In February 1943, Madame Chang came to the United States in the name of seeing doctors. Her real mission was to get as much aid as possible. This elegant China First Lady created a big sensation throughout the United States. She was a perfect combination of the Oriental classics and the Western elegance in a sharp, astute style. The Americans were completely overwhelmed.
That all men are created equal.
On February 18th, Madame Chang made a speech to the joint session of the U.S. Senate and Congress. Her speech was often interrupted by applause.
I can also assure you that China is eager and ready to cooperate with you and other peoples to lay a true and lasting foundation for a sane and progressive world society which would make it impossible for any arrogant or predatory neighbor to plunge future generations into another orgy of blood.
The speech drew rapturous applause. Millions of Americans listened to the speech on radio. Her Southern accent and her affectionate, righteous words won them over. The very next issue of the influential Time magazine had her on its cover. Madame Chang's speech had immediate effect. A day later, President Roosevelt announced that U.S. assistance to China would be increased. A few days later, Roosevelt promised Chiang Kai-shek that he'd send 500 airplanes as soon as possible. Chennault was close to achieving his goal. On March 3rd, Chennault was promoted to Major General. A week later, a new unit, the U.S. 14th Air Force, was formally established. Chennault was its commander. He finally realized his dream of commanding an Air Force. (1943) was the turning point of World War II. In Europe, the Soviet Union won a great victory in the Battle of Stalingrad and started a full-scale counterattack on the Germans. With Italy's surrender, the battle in North Africa came to an end. The combined U.S., British, and Canadian troops prepared to open a second front through the biggest invasion in history. In the Pacific, the Japanese lost heavily in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and with that, Japan lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Working in concert, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine forces were gaining the upper hand against the Japanese in the South Pacific. Desperate to reinforce its troops in the Pacific, Japan needed to get free from the Chinese quagmire. It needed to land a knockout blow against China. Therefore, the Japanese headquarters made the growing American air forces in China their top priority target. In March 1943, the Japanese Imperial Air Command deployed 2 additional fighter groups and 2 bomber groups to China. Their goal was to knock out the fledgling 14th Air Force. Chennault's 14th Air Force was composed of a fighter group and just 2 bomber squadrons. It was the smallest air group the United States established during the war, with less than 100 aircraft at the beginning. But it had an important feature. It inherited the fighting style and fighting spirit of the American Volunteer Group. They still painted their planes with wide-open shark mouths. Their pilots were never afraid of fighting. The Chinese people still affectionately call them the Flying Tigers. The priorities of the Japanese Air Force Spring Offensive were the 14th Air Force's main air bases. They even threw down the challenge letters over Lingling Airfield, calling it an air duel. The Flying Tigers were outnumbered. Chennault had to fight a 2-front war, so he didn't take the challenge. On one hand, the reinforcements from the United States to the 14th Air Force were not yet in place, nor were its materials and supplies. On the other hand, he did not want the Japanese to find out his disadvantage in numbers. Chennault had his plan. He was going to use the resources in hand to consume the Japanese Air Force bit by bit. On April 28th, the Japanese aircraft attacked Kunming Airport. The U.S. fighters scored an 11-0 victory. One of the most famed pilots, Captain John F. Hampshire, the sharpshooter in the air, shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. Added to his previous successes, he had shot down 15 Japanese aircraft, becoming one of the top aces in the CBI theater. 4 days later, a battle over Lingling Airfield took place. The 14th Air Force sent 16 fighters to fight against 47 Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Hampshire shot down another 2 Japanese aircraft. After the fight, the U.S. aircraft came back to the airport. It was only then that the squadron commander, Allison, realized that Hampshire did not come back. Soon enough, the Chinese ground forces sent a telegram saying a P-40 crashed in the Xiangjiang River, and the pilot was seriously injured. The news came as the victorious U.S. pilots were celebrating their victory. A few minutes later, the news got worse. The shocked pilots learned that Hampshire died. Hampshire's death deeply saddened Chennault. But he knew that without blood, there could be no victory. An ambitious air offensive battle plan was brewing in his mind. If a knockout blow is needed, he'd give them one and wipe them from China's sky.